I see it's 3 p.m. I think we are ready to start. So my colleague Akella will continue to admit those who are waiting on the waiting room up into this training session. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Again, welcome to this training series on project management during emergencies. It is really my pleasure to be moderating today's event. Very quickly, I would like to remind all participants to keep your microphones muted and your cameras off throughout this event. This will help the speakers not to be disturbed while they're presenting. So please, as a reminder, everyone keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. My name is Paula Padrino, and I am an Associate Project Coordinator at UNEP's Disasters and Conflicts branch. For the past year, I've been working on a project looking into the environmental impacts of COVID-19, and as well, I am coordinating the work on modern technologies for disaster management. And as I said, today, I'm very excited to be moderating this first session of this training series. Over the past 2 years, COVID-19 pandemic has affected all industries and has dramatically impacted all spheres of human life, such as the way we live, the way we socialize, and the way we work. Having said that, COVID-19 has not been the only disruption that project managers have experienced in the last years. Projects have continued to be affected by other types of unexpected events that can be disasters such as tsunamis, cyclones, earthquakes, or volcano eruptions, but also political instability, military coup d'etat, or regime changes. Scientists keep warning us about the climate crisis and how... Dear all, please, I remind you to please keep your microphones muted, otherwise it makes it very difficult for the presenters to keep a training session. As I was saying, the scientists keep warning us about the climate crisis and how it increasingly threatens every aspect of human life, and they call for urgent action and need to adapt to this situation. A recent example is the report published this Sunday by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I would like to share with you a very, very quick video of a minute that it gives an idea of how hazards will become more common than ever before. So Mateus, if you can please share that video with us.
A new UN climate report paints a dire picture. Scientists say dangers from global warming are coming faster than previously thought. And the world has a brief and rapidly closing window to adapt. The panel of more than 200 scientists found that if temperatures increase 3.4 degrees by 2100, today's children will experience 5 times the floods, storms, droughts, and heat waves. By 2050, 1 billion people will face coastal flooding due to rising seas. If the world warms by just 1.6 degrees, the amount of land burned by wildfires will increase 35%. Already, nearly half the world is experiencing significant risks from climate change. Scientists say every bit of warming counts. And more people are going to die each year because of it. Just how many depends on how much heat-trapping gas we continue to spew into the air. The panel puts out a report every 5 to 7 years. The UN Secretary General says this latest report is a, quote, atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership.
Thank you very much. So with this context in general, and I want everyone to think about your personal situations where you're based. At the Disasters and Conflicts branch, we work in contexts where crises arise at any time. For many, many years, our project managers have continued to provide support to our member states, and we have continued to deliver our projects in volatile and very difficult situations. That's why we decided that it would be a good idea for us to share our experiences and our lessons learned with fellow UNEP project managers, but also to share this with other project managers outside of the organizations, on how to adapt to this kind of sudden onset emergencies. So today we are launching this training series, and today we'll be focusing on project planning. So with us, we have two invited experts who will be joining us for the next hour and 30 minutes. We will start off by having a more theoretical presentation by our first expert, Dr. Lax, in which he will present some elements of project planning. Then I'll pass the floor to our second expert, Marisol Estrella, who will be presenting on mainstreaming disaster risk reduction, and she will provide some practical examples and share her experiences. At the end, we have allocated some time for Q&A and some discussions. So before passing the floor to our first expert, some housekeeping rules. Again, I would like to remind everyone to keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. I would like to encourage you all to submit your questions at any point using the chat box in your dashboards. We will address those questions right at the end in the Q&A and discussion. And in addition to that, I would like to remind you that you will receive a certificate of participation if you have submitted and filled in the pre-training survey and the post-training survey as well. My colleague Akella will put the link in the chat just in case you haven't filled in already. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Lax Akella. Lax has over 30 years of consulting experience in risk management, auditing, environmental sustainability engineering. He did over 12 years of research and taught at graduate and undergraduate levels in chemical and general engineering disciplines. Lax has also assisted several organizations and regulatory bodies in the development of health and safety governance frameworks, management systems, and standards. He's worked in many different countries, and just to give you a few examples, Qatar, Oman, India, Canada, and the US, and for a variety of industries, including oil and gas, petroleum refinery, chemicals, hazardous waste, construction, and many more. So, Dr. Lax, it is my pleasure to have you with us, and with this, the floor is all yours. You can proceed and share your screen.
Thank you, Paula, and welcome everyone. Let me try to share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Not yet.
Yes.
No, we can't see it, unfortunately. Okay. Maybe retry again. Otherwise, my colleague Mateus can help you.
Let me try again. Here. How about now?
Nothing is coming on my end.
No.
The moderator may need to allow, probably.
All right, yes, now we can see your screen. So if you can proceed to full screen mode, then you can proceed.
Yeah. All right, I think we are good now.
Yes, now it's perfect.
Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. As Paula has, okay, just give me a second. Let me put my timer on so that I don't exceed my. Okay, all right. Yeah, okay. As Paula introduced, okay, today's topic is project planning during emergencies. Okay, before we actually begin talking about how you do project planning during emergencies, I think it's important to understand that how the normal project planning takes place. That is project planning under normal conditions. And then we can see that how this the process needs adjustment during emergencies. I understand that we have a mixed audience today, and half of the audience are from UNEP. They are well experienced in project management. So for them, this is going to be something like a knowledge sharing session. And then for those people who are outside UNEP and then who are not too much familiar with the project management, so this is going to be some kind of an introduction to project management. But I'm not going to talk about the entire project management because we have three-part training. So which means that we will be discussing each element of planning in a series of presentations. So the first presentation or the training we are going to have is on planning, only the planning. So before we talk about the planning, I think we need to understand what a project is. There are two, if you look at this definition given by the Project Management Institute, there are two terms that you should be carefully looking at. One is what is temporary, and the second one is unique. So what it means is a project has a unique objective. It is not what you do day in, day out. So that is very important to understand, which means business is not usual. And the second aspect you need to remember is that a project is temporary in nature, which means that a project has a definite beginning and then definite ending. So it has a time frame, and then you have to work with that kind of a time frame. Again, it is not something you do day in, day out. So when you look at this a project life cycle, so as I said, that's a beginning, that is step 1, and then ending step 7. So between those two endpoints, so you have a series of steps. So first you basically conduct a feasibility study, which means when somebody comes up with a project, then you first thing you see is whether the project is feasible. And then if the project is feasible, then it goes into the, then the project actually begins from there. And then you have developed a concept, looking at the alternatives, and then you select a concept and then do a detailed design. And once you do the design, then actually you start procurement and then construction. Most projects, particularly those projects which UNEP conducts, they will have a construction element. There may be some projects which may not require any construction, but there is always a procurement. So when you say procurement, we are not talking about procurement of materials. It could be procurement of people, equipment, services, so on and so forth. So there's a procurement phase, and then the project begins. So just before the project begins, basically what you do is you have the people, you have the equipment, you have the materials, and then you said, okay, well, everything comes from different parts. Then you said, okay, let us see that if I put everything works. So that is the testing phase. Once it is testing, then actually the project execution starts. And then once the project is completed, the deliverables are made, the objectives are met, then the project closes out. So project closing out is not only the decommissioning, a very important aspect of a project closeout is lesson learning. Okay, so good and bad. So that's very important. So this is where I would like in the question and answer section, session or knowledge sharing session at the end, I would like the project manager from UNEP to actually share their lessons so that everybody learns from that. Okay, so this is the project life cycle, but a simple project runs very nicely, step 1, step 2, step 3, but most of the projects actually there will be some kind of a recycle within the steps. And sometimes you may divide this into more number of steps, and then sometimes less, it doesn't matter. But this is the whole process. Okay. Then when you're talking about project planning, the project planning is something that you do covering the entire life cycle. it doesn't matter. When you start from the beginning, then you look at all the phases from the beginning to the end. And then when you move to the next phase, then again, you start from that point and to the end. So project planning is something that you do for the entire project life cycle, not for just for that particular step of the phase. So that is important to remember. The success of a project, it is determined by what we call as the performance domains. So this is again based on the an excellent reference book developed by the Project Management Institute. It's called the Project Management Book of Knowledge, PMBOK. The recent version, I think you need to purchase it, but previous versions, you can always go to this website and then download it. This is an excellent reference for those people who want to learn about project management, not just planning, the whole 9 yards of it. The project performance domains are, that is the success of a project is determined by 8 domains, starting from stakeholders, team, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to focus on one performance domain, that is the one here, that's planning. Okay, let me have, okay, so that's the one I'm going to focus on. Okay, so this is a step-by-step approach to planning process. Okay, a little bit loaded, but the reason I made it loaded is I want to put everything into one slide so that you know the chain of events, and then you understand the interlinks between one process and another. So I'm going to spend a little bit time on slide so that you understand. So you have a project. Let's say you are a project manager. Typically, project planning is the responsibility of the project manager. So you are a project manager, and then somebody says, okay, well, this is the project, you run the project. So what is the first thing you do? The first thing what you do is you understand the project. So what is this project about? And what I'm supposed to achieve from this project? What are the objectives of the project? What are the deliverables? What is the scope? Scope means what are the boundaries? Okay, so this is what we need to do. I don't go beyond this one. So you understood the project objectives and then the scope. So next thing you need to do is, as a part of project planning, is basically what are the stakeholders' requirements. So the stakeholders for a project are many, starting with the person or the organization funding the project. That's the key stakeholder. Then the beneficiaries of the project, which are most of the time in the UNEP context, these are the local communities. And then you have government regulators. Then you may have, obviously you are going to, when you run a project, you need to have a team, which means they have internal stakeholders. Then you run a project using external resources, the contractors and then vendors. So you have them and anybody like an NGOs. So basically what you do is you understand the stakeholder requirements, which are, some of them are contractual, which is very clearly spelled out in the contract. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to deliver, how much, where, when, all those kind of things. And beyond that, there are the regulatory requirements, local, international requirements that you need to understand. Then there are quality requirements, then health, safety, and environmental requirements, and security. So security of the site as well as security of the personnel. And then last but not the least, all the requirements that relate to the corporate social responsibility, which means the communities. So you understood the project scope and the objectives, then you understood the contractual requirements. And then the next step is to see that, okay, what are the project deliverables, the key deliverables and the milestones. When a project, you said, okay, this is what we want to achieve. And to do that, you said, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's most of the time it is written in the project scope itself. So you just take all the key deliverables and then milestones, and then the heart of the project planning is what we call as a work breakdown structure. Okay, so I think those people who are familiar with project management, probably they know it. And some of you might have heard about it. So Microsoft Project is an excellent tool to develop this work breakdown structure. There are other softwares. I would suggest that because everybody has access to Microsoft software, I would suggest that you seriously try this Microsoft projects. An excellent tool to develop your work breakdown structure and then actually do the project planning. Not only do the project planning, actually you can follow it up and then you can update it. So what does the work breakdown structure does? So basically what it does is you take each key deliverable and then you said to achieve that deliverable, what are the key tasks and activities I need to do? 1, 2, 3, 4, as many as you need, distinct tasks. And each task you said, okay, what we need to do and how long, okay, so how long it's going to take and what kind of resources you need, both the human, material, equipment. Like to give an example, let's say that the project is to build 10 schools, a simple example. Then you take, okay, well, I need to build a school at a location A. Then he said, okay, to do that, what you need to do? First, I need to acquire land. Okay, so the land acquisition. Then you said, okay, to do the land acquisition, okay, what do I need? I need some PRO to do the job. And then I need this much time. And then I need this much budget to do that. And then these are the things you need to do. So that's basically the work breakdown structure. So the important thing is that if you break it down to as many distinct tasks as possible, then you get a better clarity. Then how many? It just depends. If it is too many, then it becomes too cumbersome. If it's too few, then it becomes okay. All right. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Right. Okay. So then from 4, we are moving to the step number 5. So step number 5 is each task you identify how much time it takes and what are the resources we need. And both the resources could be human resources, material, equipment, and so on and so forth. So then the next step is, then you have identified this is the requirements I have, resources, and then what is the budget. So that is also part of the project. So most of the time, budget is given for the entire project somewhere, but then you need to go break down the budget to each task so that you understand that that particular task can be carried out. And then, okay, so then the work breakdown structure almost coming to an end, but there is a very key part in the work breakdown structure. It's basically you have all the key tasks, and then you have to establish the sequences. Not only the sequences, you need to understand the interlinks among these tasks. So essentially, I think some of you must be familiar with what is called as a critical path. So basically what you do is, you know that, okay, you started the project here and the project is going to end there. And then you have some kind of a flexibility whether you can complete this task sooner or later. But there are some tasks which, if you don't do that task, for example, if you don't acquire the land, then there is nothing you can do. You cannot proceed further. So you identify the critical path, and then you identified, okay, this is the key task. If I fail to do that, then project is at a risk. So that is another thing that's very important to do it. So once you do that, well, basically you will be focusing on those critical steps. And then then you will giving more focus to that one. So once that is done, actually the work breakdown structure is completed. And then the next thing we need to look at it is you have a project team, what are the roles and responsibilities of each project member? And then the next one is it's communication. Okay, so the communication is both internal and external. So this is basically, in a simple terms, this is how you do the project planning. And once you have done the planning, then okay, I'm having some difficulties. Okay, right. So when do you start doing the planning? You start early. Okay, this is very important. Always start the project planning as soon as possible. Once you are assigned the role of a project manager, as soon as possible start the project planning. That's very important in the planning process. And second thing is that the planning, as I said, that you plan for the entire project, not for that particular step. Okay, it is understood when you start in the beginning, then you do not have much information on what follows next, like the detailed design, then commissioning, and then execution, closeout. So you may not have a lot of information, but that should not stop you from planning for the future steps. So that could be course planning. So always a project plan should cover the entire life cycle. You start early. And when you start initially, you do a high level planning because you don't have much information. But if you have information, make it detailed. And then the last important thing is the plan should be adaptive. Adaptive in the sense, what we sometimes call it a dynamic planning, which means that you develop a plan and then just you don't shelve it. The plans must change, will be changing day in, day out. So the reason you plan something and then you have a setback and then you have something else, then you keep updating the plan. So how frequently you update it? Well, if you keep updating on daily basis, then actually it could be quite confusing and then a bit destructive to the people to implement it. But if you start updating your plan every half a year or every year, then it becomes stale. It is not uncommon people to do revising the plan on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, but then as a project manager, you'll be taking a look at the project on at least a weekly basis and see whether it requires any revision or not. Then what are the key elements and then deliverables in the project planning? Okay, again, I'm not going to go into the details because we really don't have that much time. But during the design stage, the key deliverables as part of project planning is you will be focusing more on the project management roles. Who will be doing what? Okay, so that you need to have a team, then you need to know that, okay, well, this is the team I have, and then these are the responsibilities. So unless you fail clearly establish the responsibilities of each team member, and then they said, okay, well, everybody do what you can do, the project is going to fail. So clear roles and responsibilities important. And then also equally important is that you should have a project management manual procedures. So people should know this is the right way to do things. And if you don't do that, then you will have a problem. Then project design standards, codes and guidelines. This is also important because this is not only a contractual requirement, but the quality requirement. If you do not have those standards, then you are not going to deliver the project with the quality that required. And also equally important in the plan during the design stage to understand clearly what are the approval process and then who should approve whatever your plans or deliverables. Both it could be internal and external. Okay, internal are probably easy to handle, but external is something that if you don't know, then you may have a lot of handicap. Like, for example, that you have a construction plan for a school, and then the local requirements, regulations require that this plan has to be approved by the local authority, some land planning or whoever. And if you do not understand the process, and then they say that, okay, well, our procedure takes 6 months, then your project is doomed. So you have got to understand that. And then also the stakeholder engagement is extremely important. Stakeholder engagement takes place from the time you start this project till the time you close the project. Because the stakeholders, particularly the local community case, if they are not happy, they can do quite a bit of damage to your project execution. During the construction phase, we need to have the key elements are going to be the procurements of material, equipment, construction workforce. Sometimes that could be a problem, finding somebody locally. If you cannot find somebody locally, if you have to get somebody from outside the country, then there are a lot of legal immigration requirements. That is something you need to worry about. Procurement of utilities and logistics. Most of the time you assume that well, to do the construction, it needs electricity, it needs water, it needs fuel, then they have to come from somewhere. So you have to clearly understand. And also equally important is the waste disposal. Whatever waste comes out, where can it go, where it cannot go, and then also the regulatory permits. During the execution, most important thing is the control of operations. That is, this is the right way to do things, this is the wrong way. And then equally important is the maintenance of assets, particularly if you have some equipment. Equipment should be in good condition and should be maintained well. And then quality, health, safety, environment management, including incidents and non-compliances. And then performance monitoring, review, and improvement. Okay, during the execution, there should be a process where you constantly monitor the performance of the project, review it, and then find ways to improve. Okay. Okay, so I have another 5 minutes, so I'll try to complete as quickly as possible. Okay, so we talked about work breakdown structure. And then we talked about one of the elements, if you remember, one of the steps you remember is the budget. Okay, so the budget could be financial budget, or it could be budget with respect to the number of people you need to have to achieve a task, and even the time, the resources like equipment, materials. So a part of the project planning is you need to have these kind of estimates. So there are certain factors that cause us the uncertainties in estimates. The first one is what we call range. I think everybody knows that. So basically, when you come up with particularly in the initial stage, you come up with a number. The number could be said, okay, you cannot say that, okay, I need 52. So you may say that, okay, I might need from minimum 40 to maximum 65. So that's the range. And if the range is lower, which means that you have more confidence. If it is wider, then you are still trying to get hold of things. So accuracy. So accuracy is related to the range. So the range becomes narrower, then you have better accuracy. If it is longer, then you have less accuracy. Then this next one is the precision. Okay, the precision, sometimes people get confused. They think that precision is same as accuracy. There is a difference here. Precision means being precise. Like if you say that I need a lot of people, then that's not precise. If you say I need 52 people, that is being precise. So that's the difference between accuracy and precision. And then confidence. So how confident are you when you say that I need between 40 and 65? How confident are you? Okay, the confidence comes from two factors. One is you have better data, you have clear data, then you have experience. Okay, experience most of the time in project planning, experience counts. Okay, so data and the experience both are important. Experience is even more important. Planning variables. Okay, so what are the things that can screw up planning? Okay. Because we don't have much time, I'm not going to go into the details. We will share this presentation with you. But quickly, the planning variables can be divided into 4 classes. Regulatory, could be national, local, trade embargoes, immigration, whatever. Then you have market variables. Market is something changes. I think now everybody knows that the Russia invaded Ukraine, and then the oil prices went through the roof. So then that changes everything. So the market conditions, then you have political and then socio-cultural environment, and particularly when you go to the developing countries, you will see a lot of religious and cultural sensitivities. They can throw a little bit curveball into your planning process. Then corruption is another big thing. Then you have civil protests and environmental. Okay, environmental, you have natural disasters or man-made disaster epidemics. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm rushing through. So this will likely set up the floor for Marisol to discuss about the planning under emergencies. So under planning under emergencies, the variables are both external and internal. The external, I already discussed in the previous slide. And then some of the things internal, that is internal to the project team, you need to consider these human factors. So when, as a project manager, you move into a disaster zone, something that has undergone a disaster or during the disaster or an emergency. So there will be a lot of physical stress and excessive workload because you have to work with limited resources. Then there will be a lot of emotional stress and feeling of helplessness. So this particularly happens from when the project team members from a developed country, well-to-do country, they move to a very poor country. Then they see the poverty all around, and then there is a lot of emotional distress, and then people have to cope with that. So that is one thing that affects the project execution. Then many times there could be lone working long hours, working from home, so you are away from home. Then internal resource limitations. Then whatever you planned under normal conditions like utilities, they may not be available because you depend on power grid. Power grid is knocked out, so you need an alternate source of energy. Fresh water is not available, so on and so forth. Then within the project team, you can have communication issues. You may have internet may be failing, phones may be failing. And then nowadays we depend so much on the computer. So if the computer doesn't work, then what to do? Go back to the pen and pencil. That could be a problem. And
Dr. Lax, we are a bit rushing with time, so if you could wrap up in the next couple minutes.
Yeah, okay, just 1 minute. I'm going to, this is the last one, compromised working conditions, access to work locations, substandard and unsafe work environment, and health hazards. So so that will be the end of my presentation. So just to wrap up in 30 seconds, basically what it says. Most of the slides I showed you that how you do the planning under normal conditions, and then the key principles. You can read this book of knowledge, and then you know that. And then these are the factors that are introduced when you are working on a project in the emergencies disasters. Okay, thank you for your time. And then if you have any questions, then we will address those questions later on, and then over to Marisol. Paula.
Thank you very much. Apologies for that, but we are really running with time, and we'll have more time throughout the Q&A to address all these planning variables and how do they affect project management and planning. So up next, we will have our second speaker of the day. So Marisol Estrella. Dr. Lax, you can stop sharing your screen so that Marisol can proceed and start sharing hers. So Marisol is based in Geneva, and she's the program coordinator for disaster risk reduction in the Disasters and Conflicts Grant at UNEP. She's also the coordinator of the UN Environment Oil for Development Partnership, where she supports on capacity building under the environment pillar of the OFD program. She has both fieldwork and policy advocacy experience in the field of environment and disaster risk reduction, working in Asia, Africa, and Caribbean regions. She has over a decade of experience in developing and delivering trainings and coordinating partnerships. She holds a master's degree with distinction in environment, development, and policy from the University of Sussex, and a bachelor's with first-class honors in anthropology and environmental studies from the University of McGill in Canada. So Marisol, welcome to you as well. The floor is all yours. I see that you're trying to share your screen.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula, and thank you, Dr. Lax, and welcome to everyone on our webinar. Can you see my screen already? I've already shared screen.
Okay, now we can see your PowerPoint. You just need to select on the full screen mode. Perfect, that's fantastic.
Okay, I'm just gonna really put a timer on myself so that we have enough time for Q&A. So my presentation today will be Dr. Lax said that he was going to take one slice out of the project management cycle, which is focused on design planning, project planning and design. And I'm going to take an even smaller slice within that slice of Dr. Lax, and focus on something that perhaps you may already be cognizant of when you are planning for your projects and implementing your projects, or not yet. So I think it was really appropriate that the team shared the video that we watched earlier to start the webinar, because this is a topic that I think everyone really, whether or not you are emergency, working in emergencies or working in the disaster management domain, I think everyone who is executing or planning, implementing projects need to keep in mind some of these elements that we're talking about. So from my side, I mean, of course, I can share about my experiences in general with regards to project design and planning, following the project management cycle. We have our own tools that I'm happy to also talk about, and our own experiences with designing and implementing projects in general in UNEP, in our branch. But what I wanted to do actually was focus on something much more specific, which is really looking at disaster and climate risks, and how can we take that into account into our project design and planning, whether or not you are working in the public sector or the private sector. And why is this a relevant topic, right? So, as we know, and you saw in the film, that disaster risk, climate risks, and impacts are increasing. If you can just see from this global map, in the last 20 years, the number of disaster events, simply by just looking at natural hazards, have really increased over this last 20-year period. And this is not even counting disasters induced by technological or industrial accidents, for example, right? And of course, climate change simply also just exacerbates the disaster impact and disaster risk. And as we see here from a study by the UN Office on Disaster Risk Reduction, that over the last 20 years, we really see an increase in disaster events reported, number of people who are affected, and also the total economic losses, more so than if you were to compare it in the previous 20-year period. So this is really something that we are all living with, whether we like it or not, and it is part of our operating reality when we implement projects. And just, as we know, we just have to keep in mind, obviously, that disaster risks and climate risks, impact people globally differently. You may have high economic losses in high income countries, but in terms of total GDP, it's the low income countries that are more affected because of their many factors of socioeconomic vulnerability, and a number of other factors that make the losses of disaster impacts much greater in lower income countries. So when we talk about disaster risk, we are talking about really three main elements, looking at the hazards, all types of hazards. I just list here natural hazards, but there are actually also, we have to take into account industrial and technological hazards as well, especially if you are operating or living or working in a peri-urban or urban context, right? And then we are also seeing increasing disaster risks because there are more people in general, more people who are living in hazardous locations and their assets. So, when I talk about assets, it's like buildings, infrastructure, their livelihoods, etc. And that is also then interspersed with vulnerability factors. And this is where it becomes more complex. When you talk about people's vulnerabilities to disaster impacts, there's a number of factors that come into play in terms of, socioeconomic status, income, their gender, level of knowledge, etc. But one major factor is ecosystem degradation, environmental degradation linked to poor land use practices that also can increase risk. I mean, you've seen that, let's say deforested landscapes can lead to, for instance, more flooding or more sedimentation, increasing potential hazard impacts. And then, of course, climate change is exacerbating disaster risk across the board and highlighting even more people's vulnerabilities. So we'll come back to this. So just to illustrate it in concrete detail, what we see, for example, when we go to countries where we implement, we see this trend. For example, this is a picture from Nepal taken by a colleague of mine, Karen Sudmeyer, who basically showed that a floodplain area over like a 5-year period was in fact taken over, let's say, by illegal settlements, basically increasing their exposure to floods because it is a floodplain. And the blue markings actually show where flood risk is a natural occurring event. But when people start to move into this area, their exposure to flooding increases, obviously, and then everyone is surprised when a major flood comes. But in fact, they're just living in a floodplain area where there is a high flood risk. So really good management in terms of the ecosystems and the floodplains and watersheds in which we operate can help reduce disaster and climate risks already. So this is just to illustrate what I was trying to say. So this is something that we do in our projects, is really looking at how this environment and disaster and climate risk interface interconnect, and how we can really maximize the role of nature and well-managed ecosystems to help prevent and mitigate hazards and hazard occurrences, and also reduce people's exposure to these hazard impacts. At the same time, reducing vulnerability by supporting people's livelihoods. So really looking at the disaster risk equation, right? So just keeping that in mind, hazards, people's exposure, and vulnerability. So these are some of the things that we really take into account in our project design. And when we in UNEP, in our team and in our branch, looking at how then ecosystems like forests, wetlands, coral reefs can be managed in a more effective way that also contributes to overall risk reduction. Okay, so let me just then jump to how we go about doing this. I mean, the first real easy step to how you would incorporate disaster and climate risk into project design and planning is starting with risk assessments. And to do a risk, I mean, there are so many tools. If you just Google out there and say, risk assessment tools, you will come across so many different types of tools. And these are at the end of the day, these are all very good tools, but it depends on what you need the tools for, right? So, but generally, all of these risk assessment tools have capture the following information. So you're basically
Sorry, Marisol, we have lost your audio, so let's give a couple seconds, see if we regain back connection from Marisol. I have a colleague of mine who's gonna go assist right now. Please, everyone, let's give just a couple seconds until we have Marisol back with us. Just to make sure it's not the internet on my end, if anyone can write on the chat that you're actually hearing me.
Yes, Paula, no problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. It was getting really interesting. Such a shame that we lost Marisol right there, but I'm sure we will gain back her audio in a few seconds. Okay, I see Marisol is back with us, but we can't hear her yet. Yes, if we don't hear back from Marisol in a couple of seconds, perhaps we can take a few of the questions that we have from the audience to sort of keep up with the training, and then we can continue. Let's see. Okay. All right. So in this case, I think, Dr. Lax, if you want, if that would be okay for you, perhaps we can take 1 or 2 questions from the audience in the meantime that Marisol is able to regain her internet connection and she can continue with her presentation. Would that be okay with you?
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea.
Okay.
Okay. Unfortunately, the first 2 questions is not my expertise. I think the first question is about the in the chat box. Can you see it? There's a question from Dr. Mujib. How
Hi.
can we? Okay, so Marisol is back.
Marisol is
great.
back.
But go ahead. If you're in the middle of answering a question, Dr. Lax, please go ahead.
No, actually, this question is for you.
It's for me. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure where I stopped, where the screen froze.
I think you are in the disaster risk assessment.
Okay.
We can get you through it.
Can you see now the screen?
Not yet, but
share screen. Sorry about that.
No problem. We can see it now. We can see your screen.
You can see it now. I came into the office specifically to get a good internet connection, and so hopefully that works now. You can see it? Yeah?
Yes, I confirm.
Okay, so essentially, I mean, as I mentioned, that there are a number of risk assessment tools out there. You know, you can pick and choose what you want. But the important thing is to be aware that, you know, disaster and climate risk is present in wherever we may be, where you might be operating or designing or implementing a project. And essentially, I've listed the key elements that goes into the risk assessment process, you know, collecting the available data regarding hazards and disaster climate data sets, understanding, you know, who is exposed, you know, to potential disaster and climate risks, looking at people and assets that are exposed. But I think the more complicated generally is when we start looking at, you know, when we try to understand vulnerabilities, you know, people's vulnerabilities to disasters and climate change impacts, for example. And this one, you can really have a very wide variety or have a very focused assessment. So I'm just putting this here just to just have it in our minds that we're, you know, looking at both governance structures, institutions in place, social networks in place. But what I wanted to highlight here was really understanding the risk drivers. What factors contribute to increasing disaster and climate risk in the context that you're operating? So generally, this is related to environmental degradation or, you know, socioeconomic factors related to poverty, or maybe cultural factors related to how households or society is organized, etc., which may be increasing their risk to disaster and climate change impacts. And then from there is essentially then you create a picture of what are the potential disaster climate risks in your project context. But the important thing to remember is that there is not just one hazard. So if you know, and not just focus on one particular approach to, let's say, addressing, let's say, flooding. Like people say, oh, there's lots of flooding here, and just assume that there's only flooding, because there can be many multiple hazard, you're in a context of multiple hazards that could be possible. So to be able to see that in a sort of systematic and holistic way. And then understanding, obviously, how climate change is impacting in your project context, how it's changing hazards, hazard frequencies, intensities, how is it impacting on people's vulnerabilities, for example. Let's say with less rainfall, people's agricultural systems may be much more compromised, let's say, and so their vulnerabilities are much higher. So that's how looking at sort of a systemic multi-hazard way approach to risk and risk reduction. Okay, so then I won't spend too much time. I just wanted to point out where you might get some of this data sets related to disasters and climate disaster impact losses in your area, in specific countries at global scale, but also at country level scale. So these are generally some of the key global data sets that is possible. And of course, the IPCC reports gives the most up-to-date reporting on climate change and potential climate change impacts at a regional scale, at a global scale. But I wanted to share with you what we've done, let's say in our projects where we've done participatory risk mapping involving local communities, in fact, in a watershed. And this shows one example in DR Congo, where they actually built a sample, like built together their watershed, built a model to scale of their entire watershed, and to be able to understand and see what is the disaster risk context in which they live in and in which their livelihoods are part of. And so by doing that, by understanding where the hazard prone areas are, where their livelihood activities are located vis-a-vis these hazard prone areas, people had a better understanding of how, you know, some of their activities impact on disaster risk, and how they have to start to adapt and actually put in measures to reduce their risk, in this case, to flooding and sedimentation of their main river, the Lucaya River. And so it really involved, in fact, you know, the entire working with local communities in this mini sub-watershed, and then using that information from their participatory risk mapping to then design and implement projects in these different locations. So in the upper watershed, they decided to implement reforestation and agroforestry activities, also put in some erosion control measures using vetiver grass in order to reduce sedimentation downstream and strengthen their slopes from gully erosion, but also then support local livelihoods. And then downstream, they put in place as well reforestation measures, but also put in place early warning systems for monitoring river water quality and rainfall and flood monitoring, that they were working side by side with a water treatment plant located downstream. So that helped. So that was really incorporated as part of our project design and planning, and working with local communities in supporting their livelihoods in that watershed. Then another tool, I just wanted to say, I'm just giving you examples here of how we incorporate, you know, sort of risk information as part in terms of project design and planning. So this one tool is what we call an opportunity mapping tool for how to implement ecosystem-based management solutions for disaster risk reduction. So this is a it's basically looking at the interface between ecosystems and human exposure to a range of hazards. So here we've identified a number of hazards where global data sets are available, and also looking at specific ecosystems, and then crossing them over and being able to identify areas where you could design projects that are focusing on ecosystem restoration or ecosystem conservation measures that can help contribute to reducing disaster risk. Okay, so this is a global geospatial tool that we have developed with our colleagues at Grid Geneva. Okay, and in order to help direct what interventions are possible in a given country context or regional context. Okay, let me just move forward. One tool, if you allow me a few more minutes that I lost earlier, Paula. One tool that actually I also wanted to point out to our audience is the environmental impact assessments. So EIAs. EIAs are quite common in many countries. So this is this is a planning tool, actually, project planning tool used especially in the private sector when they develop and design projects that they require permits for, environmental permits from the government. But EIAs are a really good planning tool to be able to assess potential environmental impacts of what a proposed project may have. But it's also a way to incorporate, it's also a good tool to incorporate disaster risk linkages, and looking at disaster risks and climate risks in particular. Because if you're, planning a project, one, you can assume that your project can potentially have environmental impacts. And those environmental impacts, as we've seen in my previous slides, can contribute to disaster and climate risks. So for example, if you're building a road or building schools, you can change the water flow, water drainage in the area and increase flood risk, for example. But at the same time, you can also assume that as I mentioned, that disaster risks and climate change impacts can also affect your project and your project implementation in the future. So you also have to anticipate what could some of these potential problem areas that you could have with your project implementation. And then the third element that you can reflect on is then how can environmental impact mitigation actions, once you've identified the potential impacts, then you identify the mitigation or prevention actions, and how can those mitigation actions then also contribute to reducing exposure and vulnerabilities to disaster and climate change impacts. So you're not only reducing environmental impacts in general, but you're also helping to reduce disaster and climate risks through these mitigation actions. And the reason, and the fact that this is actually a quite important tool to use, the EU, in fact, then amended its own EIA directive to their member states in 2014, promoting the incorporation, mainstreaming of disaster risk reduction in EIAs. I think I'm going to stop there. Maybe I'll just stop with a few more slides, and then we can go to some questions and answers. But this is like a project that we were implementing in Jamaica, where we were mapping the shoreline erosion along a tourism area, but also a local community fishing area as well. And here we found that although, yes, climate change has contributed to beach erosion in the area, also the tourism sector has also contributed to the loss of the beaches by promoting sand mining to build hotels and resorts in this area. So it's really looking at how projects like development projects like related to tourism can also contribute to increasing disaster and climate change impact risks in local communities through this case study. So you can also look up this up, and it's available online for you to see. So let me just skip there. And I just wanted to just pause with a few takeaway messages for those of you who are project managers and project implementers, that to keep in mind that disasters and climate change can have a potential impact on your proposed projects, and therefore it's important to risk-proof your projects from the beginning, from project design and planning, and therefore undertake the appropriate risk assessments in order to understand how your project, whatever it may be, how it can reduce disaster risks, and also ensure that you're not contributing to exacerbating the impacts of disasters and climate change in your area. So I think I'll stop there, Paula, and we can turn to some questions now.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Marisol. Indeed, now we have a good 20 minutes for questions and answers. I see that we have already some questions on the chat. So I'll ask as well Dr. Lax to turn on his camera, and we can start off and kick off this discussion session. Perhaps I'll start with a question by, let me see, I have Sandesh, which I think, let's start from the button. And he's asking whether there are any specific tools or guidelines or standard practices to make sure that projects which are actually working on climate risks do not contribute or exacerbate the problems which they're trying to solve. Have you had any experience on that, and how can people make sure that this is not the case? Open to both of you.
Dr. Lax, you want to start, or I can start?
I think you can answer better, I guess. I think you are.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yes, I mean, indeed, like, just because we always say also within UNEP that just because we are implementing environmental projects doesn't mean that we're always doing good for the environment, right? And we actually need to make sure that also our environmental projects are not adding to environmental degradation. And so therefore, we also have to follow internal due diligence to ensure that we're looking at those potential impacts. So actually, what I didn't have time to talk a little bit about was when I was talking about the EIAs, right? Doing EIAs. You saw those pictures in my slides. In fact, that's a project that we had in Sudan, in North Darfur, where we were working with local communities to help improve their agricultural production. Which involved rehabilitating an existing water retention structure along the wadi, which is a dry river bed. And because water is scarce, this water retention structure is intended to capture water and spread water on the plain so that it sort of functions as an irrigation measure. But the question was, does this have an impact to the communities downstream, right? Because if you're going to retain water upstream, like what happens to the people downstream? So in fact, when we started asking these questions, then we actually we decided to do an environmental social impact assessment of the whole area, sending our hydrology and wadi experts, and then had community consultations to discuss potential impacts of this rehabilitation activity. And in the end, the decision was that we can go ahead, but put in place committees that actually connect upstream and downstream communities so that there can be communication with regards to water flow and water usage. So that was sort of the mitigation measure put in place. So I hope that helps answer your question and illustrate a bit more.
Yes, Dr. Lax, you want to add something?
But I think she already covered the most of the important aspects. I think one of the things what you do is when you do the risk assessment, okay, you put the hazard here and then you put the risk here, and then say, okay, how do I stop the path from the hazard to the risk, or from threat to the risk? And then you put the controls. So whenever you put a control, the control is to reduce the risk. So at that time, when you put the control, one of the things you need to ask is, this control, does it introduce a new risk? Okay, so that is the important aspect of risk management. So whenever you put a control, you have to ask yourself, okay, it is doing some good to this threat you have identified, but does it introduce a new threat? That's the important aspect.
Sure. Yes, indeed. Also, perhaps this is a question coming from someone who is not very acquainted with project management, but while you were doing your presentation, Dr. Las, we had somebody asking about who is actually involved in the planning processes. Is it just the project manager who is supposed to assign roles and responsibilities? In that planning process, how we can make sure that those who are involved in the planning process, that the distribution is divided equally or appropriately to make sure that everybody is sharing their role.
Yes, thank you. The principal responsibility is with the project manager. So project manager is responsible for planning. So when you start a project, then basically you have a core team. You have project manager, maybe a couple of people. So then you start with that. But ultimately, when the project comes to a maturation stage, then you have the project team, and then you have the entire project team is involved in the project planning. So typically how it is done is that the project manager may come up with a course plan, and then all the teams sits together, and then they basically do the calibration. In addition to that, typically in a weekly meetings, you sit down, look at the plan, and say, okay, is the plan Is it still okay now? Do we need to tinker with this? We need to do something else? But that kind of thing. I think that will basically follow another question from, I think, Sunil Kumar. So he was basically asking, can you stress on the agile planning compared to waterfall model? I think if I understand correctly, what he's trying to say is, when I showed the steps 1 to 7, so basically I'm talking about a predictive model. Okay, you have step 1, step 2, then move to step 2 to step 3, this kind of thing. So basically you are predicting, okay, so this will happen here, so you're not going back. But as I said earlier, the plan is never that kind of predictive. So you need to have an adaptive approach. Adaptive approach means that every time you just keep looking back, okay, from the knowledge, from the experience you have already to that point, and then sort of you keep on recycling. So this is basically what is called as adaptive or
Agile.
Yeah, agile planning.
I wanted to add. I'm sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just one more second. I think one of the key important things in any risk assessment or planning is what you call as a management of change. So you have a plan, and then okay, you come up with all those kind of things, and then suddenly when you start executing, then you see that okay, well, this doesn't work. I need to change something. I cannot use this equipment, or I cannot use this process, or I cannot use this particular material. I need to change. So that is perfectly all right to do that. But whenever you do, you have to apply what is called as a change management procedure, or management of change, or MOC procedure. So that essentially is risk assessment. So you said, okay, well, this is what I thought I would do, and I am going to change this. By changing this, what is going to happen to my objective? Okay, so the targets. So is it going to change? Is it going to introduce new risk? So a risk assessment is a complete part of an event within the project planning. Whenever you change things, you do the risk assessment. Okay, so that a key element in project planning or project execution is the management of change. Yeah, and many of the, particularly in the industry, lot of accidents happen because you do not manage your change.
Or also manage risks, right? So I wanted to add to that, Dr. Lax. I think that's really important point. You know, when you do project design and planning, there's always that risk assessment segment, like right, which is why I really touched on it, because depending on what your project is, and depending on where you are, where you're implementing your project, the risk assessment will tell you, you will have to make a decision whether the risks that you're assessing is so substantial that you have to actually incorporate it as part of your project design in terms of defining your objectives and scope. So let's say your project objectives can be adapted, or the scope of your project will have to accommodate, let's say there is a very high disaster risk in your project area. You will have, whatever project you're implementing, you will have to incorporate that as part of your project sub-objective to manage that disaster risk. So you don't keep it at assumption level, right? You don't say, oh yeah, okay, I know that there's potential flooding. Hopefully it's not going to happen during my project. You know, you will have to say, okay, there's major flooding potential in my project. What do I need to design now in order to manage that flood risk? How can I reduce that flood risk? How can I ensure that my project can continue operating even if a flood were to occur? So that's the kind of thing that you have to decide after you've done your risk assessments. Or it could be something very small. then you don't have to, you just keep it sort of like, okay, it's a part of your project assumption that this is possible, but it's the risk is low. So you just keep it, you just continue to evaluate as you implement your project.
Yes, also related to that, we just received two very similar questions on the same topic, which from Sunil and from Vijay Jan, which they're asking about how often do they have to do this process of assessing the risk and in order to adapt their contingency actions in the project. So it's not a one-time thing, as you were mentioning. You have to continuously review these and be aware of the hazards. And if you can provide any advice on that frequency of adapting to the risk and do that type of analysis and assessment.
Well, I will take this question. So basically, whenever you introduce a change in a plan, okay, you have a plan, develop the plan, and then you see that I need to change the plan. I have to do things differently. So when you introduce a change, the first thing you have to ask yourself is that does it introduce any risk? So first you need to ask that question. Whenever any change, first thing you have to ask is, I'm doing something different. Does it introduce a new risk, or does it defeat the purpose of the control itself? So sometimes that question you can answer very quickly. You said, okay, this is a minor thing. Like, for example, you say that, okay, well, you go to this particular location, take this car, and then you said, okay, well, that car is not available, take this car. So immediately you know that that's not going to introduce a major change. But on the other hand, if you think that is going to introduce it can introduce, could be risky, then essentially you need to conduct a risk assessment. And that's where the question of a procedure management of change procedure comes. As a part of project management manual, one of the key, very important procedure is the management of change procedures. So that should be written down. And then that tells you that what kind of changes are subject to this change management procedure, and what is the risk assessment process, and how far you need to go, how high or how low you need to go to get the approval for the change. So the thing is, no change should be done unless it is risk assessed, and then that is approved. And then risk assessment, sometimes you may need to introduce more controls to that.
I think I would agree with that. I mean, I think, let's say if you are operating in a high risk area, I mean, I'm just looking from a disaster risk point of view. For example, you know, you'll hear from our colleagues in the next webinars, like where they operate in very high risk disaster and conflict risk areas, actually. Sudan and Haiti, for example. If you're operating in this type of environment, you will probably have more, you know, checks in the system, more continuous and more regular reassessments of your work plans and your strategies in these type of country contexts. So you'll hear from our colleagues in the coming webinars on how they manage that, working in high conflict and high disaster prone areas.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm assuming the higher risk or higher prone areas, then the faster and the more checks you need to have in place. Perhaps in terms of practical matters, I think this was a very interesting question from Mr. Kumar. He's asking about capital and expenditure. So basically a project would have a budget that will be allocated, but then sometimes we have an emergency that comes along. So do you have any advice on how to plan for such capital and expenditure in the projects where there might be the possibility that there might be emergencies happening? So how do you plan for that in terms of budget and resources?
Marisol, you want to take that question?
Okay, well, I'll start, and Dr. Lax, please, you probably have more experience as well in this. So, I mean, in our case, we do have a like, let's say you set for contingencies, right? But let's say in our system, there's a cap to contingencies. So in fact, it's a huge challenge, especially with budgeting for emergencies, right? But the important thing is, again, I would say, you know, if you've done your risk assessment right from the beginning, you have an idea of what can really set your project back, and how it's going to set you back, and based on that, you can plan resources in that way. And as you also implement projects, you're always also reallocating and revising your budgets. But the important thing is that you're not set back so significantly, right? And so that's why, again, I go back to doing your risk assessment right, and appropriately from the beginning. But like, for example, you know, like, let's say in our project in Haiti, we knew that more or less every 2 years, there's a big hurricane that hits this local area. So we were working with local fishermen, local fishers, who you know, to improve their livelihoods, let's say, in this coastal area. But for example, we realized that if a hurricane happens every 2 years, you know, like, we were helping them repair their boats, for example. But in fact, they didn't have a place to evacuate their boats should there be a hurricane. Like, every 2 years, they lose their boats, or they lose massive amount of equipment. So what we put in place there was evacuation procedures for their assets, which they never organized before. And so the resources we put in for repairing the boats, you know, really, which was a lot from our project budget perspective, we didn't want to lose, right? And so we had to make sure that should there be a hurricane, we don't lose those boats, and set in place these evacuation procedures, which funnily, not funnily, but we did have a big hurricane that passed through during our project life cycle, and we managed to save those boats. So the fishers actually saved those boats. So at least we didn't lose the resources that we had invested. So that's the kind of thing of how you can really use the risk assessment from the beginning to help budget ahead of time. So we had to we had to put aside additional funding for, you know, setting aside training on evacuation procedures, etc. So it did take additional resources, but not as much as if we had lost all those boats, if we hadn't planned for that. So that's the kind of thing that we take into account.
Yeah, well, it's a great example indeed.
So now, very quickly, you know, in one of the slides I showed the uncertainties in the cost estimate. So let us say that you have a project, and then for the project, the budget is fixed. Okay, the funding agency says, okay, this is the amount of money we have. You go and execute the project. Then you identify the key tasks and try to determine the budget. So one of the things is that the first one is range. So as a project manager, you do not want to get tied up with a specific number. So conservative, okay, you think, okay, this is the range. So that is how the process starts. You know, if you say that, okay, to complete this task, I need this much money and then fixed amount, then you may have surprises. So try to leave yourself a range. Most optimistic to less optimistic. And then we discussed about when the estimates can go wrong. Two important things. One is you have more data, then you have more dependence on your estimate. And the most importantly, the experience. So I think you cannot substitute experience with anything else. So more you are experienced, then probably you'll get more refinements. So if you don't have the experience, the best thing to do is to talk to people who have done. Learning from somebody's failures, that's the most important thing. And the saying goes, accidents are predictable, which means that you have to see that, okay, don't go on the optimistic roads. You can always say that be pessimistic. Okay, this can fail. Then what is my fallback? But I think in a project, once you get the project funding, if you go and ask for more money, it's extremely difficult to get more money. You can have leverage, saving money in one task and then passing on to the other. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely write down those 3 takeaways. Don't be optimistic, be pessimistic, and also like with the budget you have, it's always good to save from other tasks rather than to then have to ask for more money. So it's always good to plan that in advance. So definitely I'm writing that in my project management toolbox. So I see that we have already passed with 1 minute the time. So I know because of time constraints and other commitments, I would just like to pass the floor once more to both of our speakers. If you want to add any more other thing, any message that you want our trainees to get out of this training session with, or any last advice that perhaps come into your mind before we wrap it up. So perhaps Marisol, if you have any other final comments.
No, first of all, just thank you. And it's really a privilege to present side by side with Dr. Lax, who has so many years experience on project management. So it's really a pleasure. But yes, I mean, I think a lot of this also comes with experience and essentially consulting with especially the local stakeholders in your project area. I think that's something that we didn't touch on too much, but we assume that we know this, but talking with as many local stakeholders in your project site is really key to understanding how to plan for some of these uncertainties and risks.
Yep, thank you very much. Dr. Lax?
Thank you, Marisol. Nice to work with you. I really don't have much to add, but I'm really glad that so many people attended. And if anybody has any questions, they can always reach out to me directly or through Paula. And I'm sure Paula is going to share the slides, so you have access to that.
Yes. So very well. So I would need to also thank both of you for being part of this training. It's been really our pleasure to hear all your experiences and your advice on risk and planning when it comes to project management. And as well, thank you to all the attendees for joining. I would like to remind you all that there's a second session coming up. We will definitely share the PowerPoint slides with you so that you can refer to those while you're implementing your projects. And as well, I would like to say that you are requested to submit the pre-assessment survey and the post-assessment survey. So we will make sure that you have those links with you. And with this, I'd like to put an end to this training session. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe and healthy and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye. Have a good evening. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you so much and stay safe. Thank
Bye,
you.
madam. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Lax.
Thank you very much.